So this talk is titled Nostalgicide, which is a term that I coined a while back in the course of my research. And what it refers to is basically the death of nostalgia. So if we break the word down, the suffix -icide is defined as someone or something that kills a particular person or thing, or the act of killing. So from this we get words like homicide, suicide, infanticide, and so on. So now we've got nostalgicide. What does that mean? Well, we would all have been caught up in some social engineering psyop achieved through popular culture or entertainment at some point in our lives, depending on what generation we belong to and what sort of music we were into and where we might have grown up. A great masterclass study in how this gets achieved would be the 60s counterculture, so-called hippie flower power scene. Lots of research has been done on this movement in recent years, and it's demonstrated that so many facets of it occurred at the hands of those nice people at the CIA. So, for example, most of the LSD that was turning up at these hippie communes and these music festivals in those all-important years in the mid to late 1960s can be shown to have come directly from the CIA. Then you've got so-called consciousness gurus like Dr. Timothy Leary and Dick Alpert, aka Ram Dass, who have direct CIA connections. Also Gloria Steinem, the so-called mother of modern feminism, was an asset of the CIA. And this is all by their own admission in many cases. In interviews that they've given, they've actually confessed to having been on the payroll. So this is one scene which caught up a whole load of people in its wake. The so-called baby boomer generation, those born towards the end of the Second World War and the years immediately following, who were coming of age in the mid to late 1960s. The social engineers of the time really did a number on them. They believed that this was an organic grassroots movement which represented their ethos and the way they viewed the world, but so many aspects of it, unfortunately, turned out to be creations of military intelligence. Military intelligence is, of course, an oxymoron. Many scenes it can be demonstrated to be the case with. One that I was caught up with, because I was just the right age for it and rife for manipulation, was the acid house rave scene of the late 1980s. And to my thinking, and I've made this point in a lot of my research, in my books and in other public talks that I've done, this whole scene represented merely a reboot and an upgrade of what had been done previously in the 1960s. They just picked a new generation to drop this one on, Generation X so-called. So instead of endless quantities of LSD coming out of military intelligence sources, with this one it was MDMA or ecstasy, E pills. That was the drug of choice. You had raves in warehouses and fields and later in the big superclubs, which were the sort of hippie festivals and communes of the time. It was people coming together and enjoying music in altered states of consciousness achieved through the drugs. And so many elements of it were just simply a reboot of what had gone earlier. And there are so many other scenes that I could cite as examples of this. So for anyone that lived through these times, 99.9% of them would have been oblivious to the fact that they'd been devised by the social engineers of this world. Behavioural scientists, psychologists, those who work in organisations like the Tavistock Institute and so many others. But while you're caught up in all of this, you're having a really good time. And this is the point. My own personal experience of the late 80s going into the 90s was that it was bloody amazing. The entire decade of the 90s, I just had a complete ball. And, I get concerned sometimes because if these life experiences are supposed to be a rich cocktail of different emotions and different mind states, I'm concerned that I had all the fun that I'm going to have in this life in one big block in the 90s, and now I've got to go through all the suffering and the hardship in one big block as well. I wouldn't have minded it being more evenly distributed, but that's the way it is. So we all get caught up with these scenes, and we heard from Andy earlier about some of these psychopathic so-called elite controllers, and I'm sure many of us comprehend fully that they are deeply sick individuals. They are mentally ill. And I wouldn't put it past them to deliberately create scenes such as these to sweep up huge numbers of people in their millions. This one, for example, paved the way for the worldwide electronic dance music and club culture scene, which we still have to this day. I wouldn't put it past these sick bastards to create these scenes deliberately to send them crashing down at some point in the future, so that those who were high on the euphoria of the times find it so difficult to accept that those scenes have now gone. So the music that was around in the 90s was far superior to what we have today. That's not subjective opinion, that's actually a fact. There are scientific formulae which can prove this. Everything was better. The hip-hop, the R&B, the house music, the movies, the fashion, everything was better in those times. And now it's all gone. And I do wonder whether that's been devised on purpose to demoralise those of us that had such a great time when we were living through these things. To further emphasise the point, I do want to focus on these 4 artists that I previously mentioned. So if you asked anyone to name the 5 music artists, soloists, who had the most influence in the 1980s, they would probably come up, I guess, with Michael Jackson, Prince, Madonna, George Michael, and Whitney Houston. Out of those 5, 4 of them are officially no longer with us. So let's take a look at some strange elements of each of them, which I believe reinforce the idea that the sick controllers of this world take some of these names out from time to time as a way of destroying people's nostalgic attachment to those wonderful memories that they had in their youth. It's just one of the many methods in their toolbox of completely demoralising and psychologically damaging so many of us. So we had Whitney Houston, and it all came to an end with her in February of 2012, 11th of February. So she turns up dead in a bathtub in the LA Beverly Hilton Hotel in Los Angeles. This was in the midst of an extremely bizarre event, the 2012 Grammy Awards. So many of these large-scale music events, whether it's the US Super Bowl halftime show, the Grammys, the MTV VMA Awards, or whatever it may be, even the Eurovision these days, which used to be cheesy and camp and has now become just dark like all the others, many of them actually serve as energy harvesting, full-scale satanic rituals. And with each passing year, they get more and more blatant. So if you're paying attention and you know what you're looking for, you can see how they degenerate year by year. But if you're not paying attention and you're allowing all this stuff to go into your subconscious mind, as regrettably most in society still do, then it can be having a very harmful effect on a subliminal level. And that's why they do it. So the 2012 event, Whitney Houston's passing, was directly connected with that. In this event, we had a performance by Nicki Minaj. So she comes out dressed in the blood red colours of Saturn, in Saturn worship. She comes out with a dude impersonating the Pope. So we're off to a good start. And during this performance, Nicki Minaj undergoes an exorcism. I shit you not. What we were told was that she had this entity living inside her known as Roman Zolanski, which is obviously a variation on Roman Polanski, the famous film director behind Rosemary's Baby, alleged paedophile. And we're told that Roman was this boy who was really bad and he lived within her. And he'd been a part of her for many years. In interviews, Nicki Minaj would often start speaking in different voices. It was as if she was being taken over. So really the question is this MK Ultra style mind control, where she's got different alters, different personalities, which have been programmed into her, or is this an expression of some sort of demonic possession? Or is it a bit of both? It's very interesting that Nicki Minaj, Mariah Carey, and Britney Spears in interviews have all started speaking with the same British girl accent. So they adopt this sort of society, public school English accent. and they sound exactly the same when they do it. And this would appear to be a mind control program that they're running that they would all been subject to. And this Roman Zelensky character would therefore appear to be one such altar which gets conjured up during this style of programming. It's all very dark. I am going to end on a positive, uplifting note, don't worry. So the caveat and the disclaimer is that it's going to get dark before the end, but, we'll end on a positive note. So, how can you talk about Nicki Minaj at the Grammys without going dark, right? So she exercises Roman Zelensky live on stage and says that she's got him out of her. So what could possibly go wrong? This is the LA Beverly Hilton Hotel, and this is where the Grammys took place that year, and this is where Whitney Houston was discovered dead in one of the upstairs rooms. I visited this place when I went to Los Angeles a few years ago. I had a tour of Laurel Canyon, which is where so many of these influential musicians from the 60s counterculture congregated. So I went up round there, saw Frank Zappa's old house, Jim Morrison's old house, the site of the so-called Tate murders, the Manson murders, Cielo Drive. Also saw the motel where Janis Joplin was discovered dead, the house where Michael Jackson was discovered dead. It's a really cheerful tour, yeah. I recommend it. Good for the family, So this is the LA Beverly Hilton. And in the story, we have Whitney Houston, Bobby Brown, the singer, who was her husband. And together they had a daughter who they named Bobby Christina, who is pictured here. Now, the odd thing about it is that 24 hours before Whitney Houston was discovered dead in that bathtub in the hotel suite, her daughter, Bobby Christina, was also discovered unconscious in a bathtub in the same suite. So she was revived. She survived. The headline here says, How Whitney Houston Saved Her Sleeping Daughter Bobby Christina from Drowning in the Bath just hours before the legendary singer was found dead in the tub at the same hotel. So if you are prepared to accept that Whitney Houston's death was some sort of ritual sacrifice, and if that sounds like too much of a reach when you first hear the suggestion, when you start to look into this whole subject area and when you do a real deep dive on it, you come to discover that, unfortunately, the occultists, because that's what they are, dark occultists who control these industries, aren't averse to getting rid of one of their own from time to time if it suits some kind of agenda. And they particularly like to do it when the artist in question has either passed their sell-by date and their usefulness to the industry, or if they've rocked the boat in some way and become a bit of a loose cannon and a pain in the arse. See Michael Jackson and Prince, as we will later, also George Michael. So some feel that the original intention was for Bobby Christina to be taken out, because sometimes they take out family members of well-known artists rather than the artists themselves. Something went wrong with that plan, and so could it possibly have been changed so that Whitney herself became the subject of the sacrifice 24 hours later? This was on the day that a party was being held in her honour at the Grammy Awards. So, round about the time that Whitney was discovered, there's this story, which I've taken from the VigilantCitizen.com website. There was the story of a leak that occurred the night before from Whitney's group of suites. A man on the third floor, right underneath Houston's suite, suddenly experienced water cascading into his bathroom from above at 2:30 a.m. It wasn't just a trickle. The man called security, then went upstairs to the fourth floor to see what was going on. He swears that it was Whitney's bathtub that was overflowing. He also says that a flat-screen television had been broken. My sources at the hotel say there was a leak, but that it wasn't from Whitney's room. So there's evidence of some sort of disturbance having taken place in her hotel suite. The party that was being held in her honour was put together by this guy, Clive Davis, a long-standing record industry executive. He's been in the game since the 1960s. He's still around. I think he's into his 90s now. And he's said to have been Whitney Houston's mentor. He discovered her. He put her on the map. She basically owed her whole career to him. So he was the head of Arista Records at the time, and he got Whitney all signed up. So the party was supposed to take place in her honour. Shortly before it, we've got a piece of video here which has somehow been leaked, and it shows Whitney with her daughter, Bobby Christina, going up to Clive Davis and the R&B singer Brandy. So Clive and Brandy are doing an interview. Whitney walks up to them and hands Brandy a note. Nobody knows what was in that note. Brandy has refused to divulge the contents of it, but we can see what is one of Whitney Houston's last moments in this piece of video here.
It's my dad. It's my dad. I'll see you later. I'll see you later. Mom, come see her. Come say hi to Uncle. Come say hi to your godfather. Come say hi to your goddad.
So she beckons Bobby Christina over and she says, come and say hi to your godfather, which is how she referred to Clive Davis. The other lady there is Jennifer Hudson, who was being groomed for success and some feel was being lined up to be Whitney's successor, but her career hasn't exactly taken off. And speaking of ritual sacrifices of family members, as I was, Jennifer Hudson is very unlucky in that department. She lost her mother, a cousin and a brother all together in the same shooting incident in Chicago round about this time. So Whitney, after being discovered unconscious in the bathtub of her hotel suite, and the official verdict was that it was some sort of overdose. It's a very grey area, actually. There's no sort of official cause of death. It's just been left open to speculation. It's been suggested that she overdosed on cocaine and she'd been taking alcohol and she drowned in the bathtub. This is the way we are coerced into thinking about the exits of so many rock musicians. And they get away with it because people just assume that, oh, the rock and roll lifestyle is like that. There's drugs everywhere and crazy alcohol and, wild lifestyles. That's why so many of them check out young, right? If so many plumbers, for example, kept dying at the same sort of age, people would be asking, why are all these plumbers dying all the time? But with musicians, they just get away with it. So this is Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. Very sinister place. I've got a bit about it in my Musical Truth Volume 1 book. It reminds me of the Chelsea Hotel in New York, which is another place with a very shady past, shall we say. That's another talk as well. But Cedars-Sinai figures in the strange deaths of many celebrities, causing some to question whether it houses some sort of mind control facility. So the notorious B.I.G., Biggie Smalls, the rapper, was rushed there after being shot, despite a closer hospital being reportedly available. Whitney Houston's daughter Bobby Christina was rushed there after being discovered unconscious the first time around. Britney Spears was rushed there for a medical examination. Actor Charlie Sheen, who achieved notoriety for publicly questioning the official story of 9/11, was rushed there with a hernia pain. Others who have died there include Heavy D, Barry White, Minnie Riperton, George Gershwin, Brittany Murphy, and the filmmaker Aaron Russo. Another one whose work questioned the official story of 9/11 and implicated Nick Rockefeller as being complicit. I mean, we could go off at a tangent there, but we'll leave it right there. Also, muddying the waters in the Whitney Houston story is this character, a man by the name of Raffles Van Exel, although he has other aliases as well. Nobody really seems to know who he is, but he was allowed access to Whitney's hotel suite where he removed a whole load of the contents, including reportedly cocaine that was present. So, do you think you or I would be allowed into a famous star's hotel suite to remove evidence? Probably not. No action was taken against him. He wasn't even questioned by the police, and nobody seems to know what he was doing there. Again, from Vigilant Citizen, the one person in the Whitney Houston story whose name you've not heard and who's remained a mystery. He's a Dutchman from Amsterdam, going by the name of Raffles van Exel, but also known as Raffles Dawson and Raffles Benson. He was on the 4th floor of the Beverly Hilton Hotel in one of Houston's suites when she died. Also, he turns out to have been an affiliate of Michael Jackson. So he's probably not the luckiest guy to have in your circle of friends. Here's Chaka Khan, who was a friend of Whitney Houston's. They both recorded the song I'm Every Woman. Whitney was actually on the backing vocals of the original Chaka Khan version in 1978 when she was 17 years old. So Chaka Khan went on Piers Morgan, don't know why you would, but she did anyway, on CNN, and she was talking about the Whitney Houston incident. Elsewhere in this interview, she described the music industry as evil and satanic and warned people to stay away from it. In this excerpt, she's questioning why the party that had been lined up by Clive Davis, Whitney's mentor, went ahead even when it was known that Whitney had died and her body was lying some floors above that party. And she asks why this party wasn't cancelled in her honour. Let's take a listen to this.
I don't know what could motivate a person to have a party in a building where the person whose life he had influenced so enormously and whose life had been affected by her. So they were like, I don't understand how that party.
I had Clive Davis by pure chance in here on Friday night with Jennifer Hudson, and he obviously worshipped Whitney, and I think he must have gone through agony when he heard this news, knowing it was 2 or 3 hours till this event.
Right.
And I think he took the decision to turn it into a tribute to her. And I understand that. I mean, he obviously was wrestling with the right thing to do.
That would have been right if it really was a true tribute, and a true tribute, might have been a truer, a more honest tribute in my opinion, would have been maybe call everybody together, let's say a prayer, and let's eat dinner and go home.
Some nice diversion tactics from Agent Morgan there. And by pure chance, he had Clive Davis in the studio a couple of nights before, Pure chance. The plot thickens with Bobby Christina. So she's discovered unconscious in the bathtub 24 hours before her mother dies. And subsequent to that, friends commented that she was terrified of bathtubs, perhaps understandably, and she would never go near one. She would only take showers. So in early 2015, Bobby Christina is discovered unresponsive in a bathtub, fully immersed. So that one takes some explaining. What was she doing in a bath? It's like a reenactment of that ritual which took place 3 years earlier, where some believe that she was the original subject singled out for it. So not the luckiest family in the world. One of her friends, Deborah Reese Brooks, says Bobby Christina was deathly afraid of bathtubs after Whitney Houston's death. We can make of that what we will. Fast forwarding to 2016. 2016 was not the luckiest of years for famous musicians. So right at the start of it, we were told that David Bowie had checked out at the age of 69. On April the 20th, we're told that Prince has departed. And then right at the end of the year, we've got George Michael turning up dead in bed on Christmas Day, like you do. So we'll get on to that. But although this presentation is about those 4 80s icons that I've singled out, I can't go past this point in mentioning the unlucky year of 2016 without referencing a strange aspect of the David Bowie story. Some of you might know where this is going, but the day after we were told that David Bowie had exited this mortal coil, on Sky News, they carried the story and they wheeled out a guy going by the name of Jack Stephen. He's said to have been a record industry executive. He's said to have worked extensively with David Bowie through his career, even though nobody had heard of him, I'd never heard of him up to that point. I did a search, or attempted a search, on him. I could only find one video of him on the entire internet and 0 photographs, no biography, no Wikipedia page, no record of his time in the industry. So here's this individual, Jack Stephen, as he appeared the day after the news of David Bowie.
I was just saying earlier that I actually felt that part of me had died. I mean, I have to say that's how much an influence he is, I think, to me and to thousands and millions of people around the world.
Does he look a bit like anyone? And maybe sound like him? Shall we have another listen?
I was just saying earlier that I actually felt that part of me had died. I mean, I have to say that's how much an influence he is, I think, to me and to thousands and millions of people around the world.
It's like a part of me had died, he says. So I'm not someone who's quick to make wild claims about celebrities faking their deaths, or perhaps somehow being allowed to go into some sort of CIA-style witness protection program and live out their remaining years under an assumed identity. But got to say, there's a few oddities about that one. And this guy has not been seen nor heard of since 2016. Here's the only other photograph that I could get of him. So this was at a music conference in Nashville, Tennessee some years ago, and that's the guy that we got wheeled out on Sky News. They're supposed to be the same man. There's a few differences there as far as I'm concerned. And the reason that footage was so dodgy and poor quality is because that video used to be all over the internet. You could get it everywhere. I hunted high and low for it to put into this presentation. I could only find that copy of it. Everything else has been scrubbed. So again, we can draw our own conclusions from that. So we go on to late 2016, and that's when another major icon of the 1980s checked out. George Michael, a man possibly most famous for the song Last Christmas, I Gave You My Heart, turns up dead on Christmas Day of heart failure. All right. So, in his latter days, George was said to have been in a relationship with this guy, Fadi Fawaz. Now, Fadi is not necessarily the luckiest guy to be around either, or certainly to get into a relationship with, because prior to being with George Michael, he was in a relationship with Stephen Gately of Boy's Own. Stephen Gately dropped dead on holiday in Mallorca some years ago of sudden adult death syndrome. There's a lot of it around. Well, there is these days. He was ahead of his time. I think this was about 2014, 2015. So Fadi was said to have been devastated, and then he took up a relationship with George Michael, became his partner, so we're told. Here's a very dubious picture of the pair, where Fadi appears to be taking a very assertive, controlling role. He's leading George by the arm. George appears to be in some sort of trance-like state. When you study the photograph up close, you can see that he's got a line around his neck as if he's been garroted. And so there's some cause for concern through this picture, I would say. When you get into the murky world of MKUltra mind control and how that plays out in the entertainment industry through Monet programming and such, you find that many household name artists will have been subject to perhaps satanic ritual abuse from early childhood, depending on what family they were unfortunate enough to be born into, or perhaps later in their career, MKUltra style mind control programming. And this is done to keep them on script, to keep them churning out the music, keep them pushing the agendas, and to prevent them from going off script and going their own way. We have many examples through history of what happens to artists when they attempt to go their own way. John Lennon, Bob Marley, and so many others. So the suggestion is that Fadi could have been allotted as George Michael's mind control handler, because so often handlers whose job it is to handle the day-to-day activities of the artist in question, are presented as romantic partners or spouses. Faddy himself went a bit off the rails after George Michael turned up dead. We've got this story here. George Michael's ex, Faddy Fawaz, is caught on camera brandishing a hammer as the police arrest him over a string of hammer attacks on parked cars in East London. This puts me in mind of when Britney Spears went a bit crazy round about the time that she shaved her head and said she was trying to get all these implants out of her, and she went around attacking cars with an umbrella. This was a classic example of mind control programming starting to break down and needing to be topped up. So often when artists disappear from public view for a while after going a bit crazy, or they're said to go into rehab, what's actually happening is they're having their programming topped up. So rehab is a euphemism within entertainment for the mind control lab. So when Amy Winehouse was singing, "They're trying to make me go to rehab, but I say no, no, no," I think she was talking about something different to what we might assume. So George, we're told, was found dead in bed on Christmas Day by his lover, Faddy Fawaz. Now, his original account was that he went to George's house, Goring-on-Thames in Oxfordshire. On Christmas Eve, they spent the night together. Faddy woke up Christmas morning, found George unresponsive in bed, and called the emergency services. He then changed his story to police, and he said, "Oh no, actually, no, I slept in my car outside." Yeah, that's right, yeah. Because we all do that, don't we? You know, we sleep outside, in the car, in the freezing cold, outside our lover's house on Christmas Eve, rather than being indoors with him in a nice warm bed. Yeah, you know, it's totally understandable. So he changed his story to the police, evidently didn't get into any kind of trouble for doing so. I wonder what would happen to any of us if we changed a statement like that, you know. And this is the incident that we had next. It was chalked up as heart failure. So if we examine what possible motives there may be for the record industry to have got rid of George Michael, we do have a few suggestions. So he did get into a legal battle with his record label, Sony. Michael Jackson described Sony as evil, and its one-time CEO Tommy Mottola, who went on to become the husband of Mariah Carey, probably a mind control handler, as devilish. We'll get on to that. So George Michael went to the High Court, and he was trying to break free of the restrictive nature of the record contract that he had with Sony. He was trying to win back some artistic autonomy and gain access to his own publishing rights and his own master tapes and things of this nature. Bit of damage limitation after George's departure coming from those nice people at the BBC, where they stated George Michael regretted suing his record label in the 1990s, a new documentary reveals. The star took Sony to court in 1992, claiming he had little control over his work, with the company treating him as no more than a piece of software. And staying on the question of is there any evidence to suggest that George may have made himself unpopular with certain aspects of the establishment, we should factor into the mix this great interview that he did in 2003 with Tim Sebastian on Hard Talk on the BBC. This clip kind of speaks for itself, and you can imagine how it wouldn't necessarily have ingratiated George to his corporate overlords.
You were so much aligned with Blair and Cool Britannia, weren't you?
No, I wasn't. No, I wasn't. I never turned up at that bloody party. Excuse me. I was never going to be used that way. When I saw Tony Blair, I saw him in Islington before he got into Downing Street, right, when he needed people like me. I saw him personally. I went and had a meal with him, discussed it, because my lawyer is a member of the Labour Party.
But you supported it, didn't you?
When?
Then.
Supported what?
The Cool Britannia.
I've never believed in Cool Britannia. No, it's not. You're not talking to Noel Gallagher or somebody from the Britpop age. You're talking to somebody who started 21 years ago. Cool Britannia is a load of bollocks to me, you know?
That's right. Cool Britannia was another psyop. Glad you're all sitting down to recover from the shock. And I know it's difficult to believe. The idea was to popularise Tony Blair. That's what it was all about. They were trying to make Tony Blair appear cool among young voters so he could be in office, ready to preside over the three major events that would follow. In Term 1, 1997, the death of Princess Diana. Term 2, beginning 2001, the events of 9/11. And Term 3, 2005, the events of 7/7. He was their man for the job in office. And they needed to make him popular. I know it's hard to believe Tony Blair was once popular, but I can recall the euphoria among certain, pockets of society when Labour won that election on the occult significant date of 1st of May, Beltane, in 1997. And Blair was presented as this cool guy. He was down with the kids, played a bit of guitar, smoked a spliff or two, in his younger years. And Blur and Oasis and that whole Britpop thing was all part of making out that Britain was undergoing this cultural resurgence, and Tony Blair was the figurehead for it. So, as George Michael says quite rightly in that clip, it was all bollocks, but then everything is. Now, we get into some very strange elements here. This is the phenomenon known as predictive programming, and it's aspects of events which are known to be coming, which are coded into TV shows, movies, and other expressions of popular culture. They are preparing subliminally the masses to accept the official version that they're going to be told through the mainstream in terms of what happened. So the Christmas Eve edition of EastEnders in 2016 featured the return of a character who'd been killed off years previously. Heather Trott had always been an obsessive George Michael fan. Her voice is heard on an old tape recording on which she states, "We can't have Christmas without a bit of George, can we?" as she proceeds to play Last Christmas. As she's heard asking character Shirley Carter to press play on the tape, Shirley replies, "What did your last slave die of?" Then, on the Christmas Day episode of EastEnders, Wham's Last Christmas crops up as the answer to a question contained within a Christmas cracker, before the other characters around the table learn that every one of their crackers contains the same question. Pub landlord Mick Carter then raises a glass to absent friends. Over on ITV, meanwhile, Coronation Street paid tribute to George as a choir was heard singing Last Christmas a cappella style in the episode screened at 8 p.m. on Christmas Day. News bulletins would announce the death of George Michael very shortly afterwards. Just to ruin everyone's Christmas night, Then, the movie world is laden with George Michael death references, particularly by way of 3 films released during the year of the celebrity death cull, which is the way I refer to 2016, because so many famous people checked out that year. Deadpool has a storyline involving bets as to which famous people will be the next to die. The film's main character, Wade Deadpool Wilson, is portrayed as a superfan of Wham. Later, George Michael's Careless Whisper plays over the closing credits. The musical La La Land, which received its theatrical release over the Christmas 2016 period, has a scene where the female lead character yells out George Michael's name for no apparent reason. It goes on. A short while earlier, in 2013, the British drama Having You includes a scene in a public toilet, perhaps a sly throwback to George's indecency charge of several years earlier, when a character makes a remark about the ghost of George Michael. The protagonist remarks, "George Michael isn't dead," to which his friend replies, "Really? Are you sure?" The recent exposure of George's music through film doesn't even end there. He's also had placements in Zoolander and in the Martin Scorsese movie Bleed for This. A world-weary cynic could be forgiven for thinking massive interest in his back catalogue was being systematically built up in the years and months leading up to his sudden death. That was also a factor with Whitney Houston, by the way. She died on the 11th of February, 3 days before Valentine's Day. Most of her songs in her back catalogue were about romantic love. And guess what happened to sales of all her records in the days previous around Valentine's Day? They went through the bloody roof, netting an absolute fortune for her record label and everyone else involved in her music publishing. So I've got here a clip from another movie. This one is called Keanu. It's written by Jordan Peele, and we've got a character who is a kind of street thug, sort of gangster type guy, and the big joke is that he's secretly into George Michael's music. You know, he loves it. And there's a scene where he sort of goes into this alternate reality and starts hallucinating, and this is what he sees.
Am I in heaven? You're George Michael. You're George Michael, man.
Coincidence? How about this? 3 years after George Michael turned up dead on Christmas Day, his sister, Melanie, also dies. Christmas Day 2019. Died in a diabetic coma on the 3rd anniversary of the pop star's tragic death. Quite the coincidence again, wouldn't you agree? So, you know, all these factors have caused me to come up with this concept of nostalgicide, and it is my personal theory that they do get rid of these artists from time to time, and destroying people's nostalgic attachment to them and all the great memories they've got wouldn't be the only reason they do it. It's one aspect of it. Most of the agendas that these psychopaths push tick many boxes all at the same time. They serve them in many different ways. So with some of these artists, they've clearly outlived their usefulness and it's decided to get rid of them. But when they do get rid of them, they do it all in a ritualistic kind of fashion and they hope that it achieves some other aims as well. So arguably the 3 most popular and influential solo artists of the 1980s. Interestingly, all born in the summer of 1958 in the Midwest region of the United States, and all grew up in abusive households and suffered at the hands of their fathers. Another coincidence. So Prince, born in Minneapolis, Minnesota on the 7th of June 1958, Madonna, Bay City, Michigan, 16th of August 1958, and Michael Jackson, 29th of August 1958. One interesting thing is that the date on which Michael Jackson is said to have passed away, 25th of June, is George Michael's birthday. And George Michael died 6 months after his own birthday on Christmas Day. 25th of June is celebrated by Satanists as anti-Christmas. Whereas Christmas traditionally represents the rebirth of the sun symbolically after it reaches its lowest point in the sky, as observed from the Northern Hemisphere, and it then begins its gradual climb back up to its apex at the summer solstice. It's a celebration of the cycle of rebirth and light returning. Well, Satanists stand for the direct opposite of that because they invert everything. So they love the 25th of June because the sun is starting to descend from its highest point, its apex, and moving gradually, slowly back to its symbolic death at what we refer to as Christmas. So it's interesting how those 2 artists' birth and death dates tie into those times. So Prince, like George Michael, got into legal wrangles with his record label. In his case, it was Warner Brothers. He protested in much the same way as George Michael and also Michael Jackson about the restrictive nature of his contract with that label. There was a point in the 90s where he changed his name from Prince and he asked to be known as the artist formerly known as Prince, and he adopted that hermaphroditic, unpronounceable symbol as his official artist name. Around that time, he took to having the word slave scrawled on his face in public appearances to further reinforce the point. This is a quote from Prince where he says, "The first step I have taken towards the ultimate goal of emancipation from the chains that bind me to Warner Brothers was to change my name from Prince to the love symbol. Prince is the name that my mother gave me at birth. Warner Brothers took the name, trademarked it, and used it as the main marketing tool to promote all of the music that I wrote. The company owns the name Prince and all related music marketed under Prince. I became merely a pawn used to make more money for Warner Brothers. So that's the symbol that he came to use. And way back in the early 90s, he was already evidently a bit pissed off with the nature of his contract, and he had these comments to make on a TV show.
The reason why it became such a big deal back then is ever since my third album, I wasn't really taking large advances from the recording companies. I was recording the albums myself in my own studio. So the way I looked at it, I owned the work because I paid for it. And I did all the work. I created it, so I felt like it should belong to me. That said, the companies felt otherwise, and they would always hold this contract up and say, well, you signed it. And I say, well, I understand that. It's not like I want to leave. I just want to, talk about this thing and see if we can't make it more fair. Of course, they wouldn't change, because if they changed, they wouldn't really exist. And that's kind of the situation we're in right today. They're not going to exist much longer. But it's not like we're against them or anything like that. The idea is that we find better ways of working with one another. It shouldn't be a situation where they own the album or the work. We're talking about intellectual copyright. If they're going to be indeed a delivery service, then that's fine. But even FedEx doesn't say that they own the thing that they ship, right? Because ultimately it keeps us apart, and it keeps the people in power in charge of us. So ultimately, we're going to have to learn how to be together and become one people. What I've been doing recently is studying the scriptures as deep as I can, so that that's what gives me the optimism. And I would advise anybody, if you want to feel like there's some hope in this joint, pick up the book and read it and get somebody to actually show you what's going on in it, because it's a real thing. You don't hear a lot of young people talking about things like I talk about, because they really haven't lived. They haven't gone through a lot of experiences yet, and we can't really expect them to. It's just not all a party, alcoholism and promiscuity. Get some elders up in here and let's talk about all this.
All right, we'll leave that there. You get the gist. So you can imagine how comments like that wouldn't have gone down too well, possibly with his record label and his handlers and whoever ultimately controls him and the industry. Also, we should factor in his appearance on a 2009 chat show hosted by Tavis Smiley, where Prince raised the issue of chemtrails, spontaneously brought it up in front of an audience of millions. So here's that excerpt from the show. He had some very interesting things to say. Prince was definitely a dude who knew a thing or two about a thing or two.
Well, when I saw the State of the Black Union, Dick Gregory really moved me and a lot of my friends. I show it to everybody that comes over the house, especially white folks, because they need to hear that, so that they know more about all of us. Mm-hmm. Because what he said affects all of us. He said something that really hit home about this phenomena of chemtrails. And, when I was a kid, I used to see these trails in the sky all the time. And so, oh, that's cool. A jet just went over. And then you started to see a whole bunch of them. And the next thing you know, everybody in your neighborhood was fighting and arguing, and you didn't know why. Okay? And you really didn't know why. Everybody was fighting. So he started riffing about the chemtrails, and he started to say things that hit home so hard. And I would recommend that everybody try to get what he said online or wherever and try to get a copy of it and just listen to it. Because I was so moved that I had to write the song. The other thing is the first line of the song says I was born on the same plantation in the United States of the red, white, and blue. And we live in a place now that feels just about like a plantation. We're all indentured servants, When I found out there were 8 presidents before George Washington, I wanted to smack somebody. Mm-hmm. I wanted to know why I was taught otherwise. Just tell me the whole story. I'll fill in the blanks, but don't
you know, don't tell me something that you think I'm supposed to know.
Right, so he's referencing there Dick Gregory, and he's saying that he learnt a lot of this stuff from him. So Dick Gregory was a comedian. He was around in the counterculture years of the 1960s. He was on the bill for The Human Being in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park in January 1967, which was a precursor to the whole Summer of Love psyop. He was involved in that. He later cropped up in 1975, where he was one of two guys who presented the footage of the Kennedy assassination, the infamous Zapruder film, for the first time on TV. Bob Grodin and Dick Gregory. This was 1975, so Americans had spent almost 12 years having been told about what happened at the Kennedy assassination, but nobody had seen that famous film until those two guys presented it for the first time in 75. So he's got quite a few claims to fame. Dick Gregory was asked about his relationship with Prince after Prince had died, and he tried to distance himself from him. He said he didn't know Prince and he doesn't care for celebrities, he doesn't hang out with them. Shortly after that, Dick Gregory went into hospital for what should have been a routine examination, and he came out in a body bag. It's a bit like Andy's presentation earlier, where all these whistleblowers end up having bloody accidents. There's quite a lot of it around, it seems. Similar sort of story with James Brown, incidentally. So James Brown died exactly 10 years to the day before George Michael, Christmas Day 2006. James Brown was in hospital, should have been a routine surgery procedure, and he died while he was in there. His family believe he was poisoned, and several investigations were opened into those circumstances. So that's Dick Gregory, and Prince would appear to have learned a lot of stuff from him. He was a very complex character. I've got a separate presentation, which I've delivered elsewhere, titled Dark Occult Aspects of Prince. I've got a whole lot about him in Musical Truth Volume 2, including an essay that was written by a guy named Dan Munro. And he's examining the themes and the motifs that were explored during Prince's early work. And what Dan found was that while Prince is best known for his sort of lewd, lascivious, sexually explicit material, every time you find a song of that nature on one of his albums, there's a deeply reflective, spiritual, reflective, beautiful song to sort of balance it out. So he appeared to be a walking contradiction. He embodied duality. So he appeared to be an asset of the system, pushing so-called Illuminati symbolism and such 1 minute, and the next minute he's imparting profound spiritual and metaphysical truths. So he's someone who clearly knew a lot. Similar to Kate Bush, actually, who I've mentioned in other talks. Definitely very clued up on a lot of the subjects that we talk about at these sort of events. But here's one more to factor into the mix as we consider whether Prince had become a target to be taken out. He certainly would appear to have had some inside knowledge of a couple of agendas before the rest of us got to find out about them. So this is a recording of a concert that he played at Utrecht in the Netherlands in December 1998. This was a little under 3 years before the events of 9/11.
I gotta go back to America. I gotta go get ready for the bomb. Osama bin Laden getting ready to bomb. Osama bin Laden getting ready to bomb. You better watch out. Look out the one.
1998, December 98. So he says, I've got to get back to America. Osama bin Laden's getting ready to bomb. America, you better watch out. And then a band member shouts out, 2001, hit me. So for anyone that might have thought that was just a random thing and Osama bin Laden had already been blamed for the Oklahoma City bombing in that year, 98, the fact that somebody then calls out 2001 is a bit of a clue, I would suggest. Did Prince have foreknowledge of that event? That would appear to stand as evidence that he did. As always, the public were the last to know. So I got a little bit on Michael Jackson, who obviously was another icon of the 80s, often compared with Prince, often put up there as a rival. The music industry does love its dialectics. It loves pitching one act against another. It's been doing it forever. In the 60s, there was the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And young people at the time were being coerced to choose a band. Which one did they go for? So if the Beatles were a bit too nice and clean cut for you, and you liked your rock groups to be a bit more edgy and dangerous, that's where the Rolling Stones came in. But ultimately, both groups were controlled by the same forces, and they were both pushing the same agendas, not least the psychedelic counterculture thing later in the 60s, which both groups embodied. Then, you know, if you're my sort of generation, you probably remember Spandau Ballet versus Duran Duran in the early 80s. And, you know, girls in my school had posters of either John Taylor or Martin Kemp. So you're being asked to choose a band there. Same thing in the Britpop era, Blur versus Oasis. Which one do you choose, you know? So it's always dialectics. So Michael Jackson was out there in the 80s and obviously before. This is a young picture of him where he's flashing up a very familiar hand signal. I'm not going to do this one myself because somebody's going to freeze frame a picture of it. And they're going to put it on the internet and say, see, I told you Devlin was a Satanist. So, yeah, I've had that one before. So there he is. This is the 666 sign, so-called, a number very beloved of the dark occultists who control the industry. This would suggest that Michael was being groomed from a very early age into that whole scene. He suffered abuse at the hands of his father, Joe Jackson. This would appear to be satanic ritual abuse. When Joe Jackson died himself, stories such as this emerged in the mainstream. How Joe Jackson whipped his kids to fame with a belt and left Michael hating him. The late Jackson family patriarch lived out his final years alone after years of cold parenting and abuse. Gets more sinister though. This is a communication from Roseanne Barr, the actress. So for many years now, Roseanne Barr has been speaking publicly about MK Ultra mind control. She says that Hollywood is absolutely full of it. Most of your favourite famous celebrities will have been subject to mind control programming. And in this message, she's specifically talking about Joe Jackson, Michael's father, suggesting that he was a handler and an MK Ultra operative. So in Roseanne's own words, Joe Jackson is an MK Ultra operative whose abuse of his own children was used to profit the CIA's programs that follow and study the effects of child abuse on the young, and how their minds can be controlled to such an extent and with such abuse that they can be forced to develop talent. Jesus said, "The truth will confound you in that day." Joe Jackson is a child abuser, and Catherine looked the other way while he beat their kids and tortured Michael mentally. Keep them both away from Michael's kids. The Vigilant Citizen website a few years ago published what are said to be secret drawings done by Michael Jackson. And they appear to reference trauma-based mind control activity. So quite disturbing in nature. Michael is said to have scrawled these himself. You've got a figure here with various electronic implants, looks like, plugged into its head. You've got one here where there's one individual who appears to have three faces, perhaps hinting at dissociation from reality and the creation of mind control alters, which happens through trauma-based programming. And then Michael was all set to make a major comeback with this series of shows in London in June 2009, when he just happens to turn up dead in LA at the hands of his physician Conrad Murray, we're told. So a nice, neat result there. It was Conrad who did it, just like it was Lee Oswald that did Kennedy, you know. No conspiracy, it was just Conrad Murray and his box of pharmaceuticals. What could possibly go wrong? So that's what we were told, and Michael exits the stage. So there are some pieces of evidence which might suggest that Michael, like Prince, like George Michael, may have pissed off some of his industry overlords, such as this from an L. Sharpton rally in 2002, where Michael has a thing or two to say about Sony and about the record industry.
Sony, Tommy Mottola. Tommy Mottola is the president of the record division He is a mean, he's a racist, and he's very, very, very devilish.
Okay, well, fairly straightforward and to the point. So another message which you can imagine might have marked Michael's cards. People have differing views of Michael Jackson and his private life. My personal take, having done a lot of research into the subject, is that Michael Jackson was not a paedophile. Those two cases that were brought against him were warning shots being fired to remind him of just how powerful those who control the record industry are and what they can do to ruin your life if you do something to piss them off. So there was the first case, which eventually got dismissed. Then another case comes along, and to me, that just serves as a final reminder. Keep in line, do what's expected of you, don't try and go your own way. And then, of course, we know how it all ended. However, nothing is clear-cut in this field of research, and in the same way as we had that mysterious character Jack Stephen cropping up on that Sky News interview the day after we were told about David Bowie, the day after we were told about the death of Michael Jackson, we had an individual by the name of, anyone remember? Dave, ring any bells? Okay, so here's an excerpt from a Larry King show where an individual going by the name of Dave is wheeled out to comment on the passing of Michael Jackson.
Joining us now here in Los Angeles, Miko Brando, who was with us almost every night after this untimely passing, longtime Michael Jackson friend attending the funeral, and Dave, yes, that's his name, Dave. He was David Rothenberg. He was set on fire in 1983, suffered, as you can see, terrible scars. Michael Jackson befriended him and paid for a lot of his surgeries. Dave is also attending the burial. Why Dave?
Well, to liberate myself from the confines of my father's criminality.
He caused the fire?
Yeah. He is a criminal, and he caused all this. To free myself of his name and his legacy, I decided to become my own person through changing my name.
Remind you of anyone? If anyone ever tells you that research of this nature is a straightforward and clear-cut thing, give them a slap. It's not. So I've coined the term Nostalgicide because I do feel that they destroy these icons who mean so much to so many people from time to time to demoralize those that grew up on them. They do the same with fads and scenes and movements. They make things really great only to send them crashing to the ground at a later stage. I think it's quite symbolic when we consider the World Trade Center towers. You know, they were magnificent structures when they first went up in the 1960s, but I personally believe that it was known even back then, at the time of their construction, that 33 years into the future, they were going to be brought crashing to the ground in 2001. So it's a symbolic representation of what we have going on with these musical icons. So solutions, well, the simplest one is, in the words of the Stranglers, no more heroes. So I'm not suggesting that we should cease enjoying music or movies or whatever it may be. I'm not suggesting we need to throw out all our albums by some of these compromised artists. I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't have singers, musicians, bands that you follow and whose work you enjoy, if the songs, if the output speak to you in some way. I'm just saying that we have to let go of the star worship, the idol celebrity worship, because the more closely attached you get to these individuals, the more devastating it is should the news come along that, you know, they've left us. So we can continue to enjoy popular culture. We just have to be mindful of the fact that it's clearly been weaponized. It's mass mind control, it's social engineering, and it's an ingenious way of achieving it. because people are off their guard. Nobody's expecting to have their worldview, their value systems, their behaviours shaped and moulded for them by, in the words of the master propagandist Edward Bernays from almost 100 years ago, men who we've never heard of. This is pretty much my central message through all the work that I do, that we just need to be consciously aware of these agendas as they're playing out. But more and more people are becoming aware of them. And one of the most promising things I've seen recently is a spate of video snippets on TikTok. So TikTok is where young people hang out, kids, my daughters, TikTok all day long on their phones. And mostly it's garbage, it's just mind-numbing, banality or really satanic stuff. But every now and again, you do get some positive content on there. And my attention has been drawn to quite a few TikTok videos where the creators are talking about these agendas running through the music industry. The satanic symbolism, the mind control stuff, the pushing of agendas like climate change or the LGBTQ thing, whatever it may be. And it makes for very encouraging reading when you look at the comments underneath. Bearing in mind these are young people, kids, teenagers, and so many of them are saying, yeah, it's so blatant, so obvious, I know what to look for, they don't fool me, throw this artist out, don't listen to this stuff. It does seem as if a lot of young people are starting to get it. By no means all of them, still a long way to go, but it's a pretty good start. I do a lot of events of this nature. I do conferences and festivals pretty much every weekend now. And the sort of demographic that comes along are pretty much what we've got here and maybe upwards a bit in age group. It's very rare to find young people coming to these types of events. But there is some evidence to suggest that many of them are starting to get it in terms of these agendas. It's just not made blatantly obvious that they do, and they hang out online, and that's where all the communication takes place. But I find that to be encouraging, and information of this nature is getting out there. It's only moving in one direction, and the more we all share it, the more the old mind control tricks and the spells will just not work anymore. We'll know an agenda when it comes along. We'll have seen the signs. We'll know how to spot it. So that process is underway. It's only going to continue. That's the good news. It was sort of 99% doom, 1% optimism, right? But at least it was there. So thank you for listening. There's more on everything that I've spoken about today in my books, which are over at the table there. I am going to be doing a DJ set a bit later. I think I'm on after. Yeah, we'll have a bit of a party. So basically all the artists that I spend time slagging off in my talks, I then go and play in my DJ sets. And we all dance to them. Yeah. Thank you.